Hello. Did you know that some of the world's oldest and most mysterious civilizations weren't born under the warmth of the sun, but under endless winter skies? Did you know that before Russia became an empire, before kings and revolutions, it was nothing more than a frozen wilderness where survival itself was a legend? Today, we're stepping into that forgotten world. And before we begin, make sure to share, and subscribe because I'm waiting to read your comments and your thoughts shape the next stories we uncover * now. Let's begin. The story of ancient Russia does not begin with kings, crowns, or empires. It begins with wind. A wind so cold it carved its name into the bones of the earth. Long before maps claimed the shape of the world, before travelers spoke of strange lands in the east, there was a place wrapped in silence and frost, stretching farther than any wandering soul could imagine. It was not yet Russia. It had no borders, no rulers, no name. It was simply the north, a raw and unforgiving wilderness where nature herself dictated the terms of survival. Imagine standing on an endless plain of white where the horizon blurs into the sky. A place where the breath of the living turns instantly to ice and falls like shattered glass. Wolves moved like ghosts through the forests. Rivers froze so deeply that travelers said they could hear ancient spirits locked beneath the ice, whispering stories older than mankind. This was the cradle of the people who would one day be called Rus. The first tribes did not arrive in great armies or with the ambition of empire. They came in small bands, guided by instinct, hunger, and the promise of untouched land. These early wanderers, Uralic, Finno-Ugrian, Slavic, and Baltic, were bound not by conquest but by the need to endure. They were hunters, gatherers, and storytellers, and each tribe carried a fire that was more than just warmth. It was memory. It was identity. It was the beginning of civilization in one of the harshest places on earth. They built no palaces. They carved no monumental statues. Their art was the rhythm of survival, boughs carved from cold oak, huts insulated by layers of animal skins, fires that never died even on nights when the temperature plunged so low that the stars seemed brittle, enough to crack. Their hearts learned to beat in harmony with the forest, the river, and the moon. Yet even in this frozen world, myths were a kind of shelter. When nights stretched endlessly, when storms swallowed the sun for days, the tribes gathered around their fires and told stories about gods made of thunder and wind, spirits who lived in the trees, and creatures who could swallow a man's shadow. These myths were not entertainment. They were survival manuals, coded warnings, and a way to explain the mysteries of a land that offered no mercy. One of the oldest myths spoke of Morana, the winter goddess who walked across the land with frost beneath her feet. It was said that every snowfall was a strand of her hair, and every blizzard was her breath seeking to test the strength of mankind. She was not evil, but she had no pity. Those who survived her long winters earned her respect. Those who fell became part of her eternal kingdom beneath the ice. Another legend told of Perun, the thunder god who lived in the sky, watching over the brave. He carried a golden axe that split clouds and shattered mountains. Whenever lightning struck the frozen ground, tribes believed Perun was marking the earth for a future people, a sign that this land, though merciless, was chosen. These early tribes lived in cycles of migration, chasing herds of elk, boar, and reindeer, moving with the seasons, always listening to the land. They learned the language of the wind, the warning signs of storms, the patterns of animal tracks. Every day was a test. Every night was a victory. But slowly, something changed. The tribes began to settle. They built wooden fortresses along rivers, especially the mighty Volkhov and Dnieper. These early settlements, called Gorodish, were the seeds of towns and eventually cities. The rivers became lifelines, highways of frozen silver in winter and flowing trade routes in summer. Canoes, carved from single logs, carried furs, honey, wax, and stories across distances that once seemed impossible. With settlement came identity. The tribes no longer drifted like snow. They rooted themselves into the earth. Families grew, rituals became traditions. The whispers of myths mixed with the rhythm of daily life until the land, the people, and the stories were inseparable. And yet, even in this early age, conflict was as common as snow. Tribe fought tribe over hunting grounds, river crossings, and sacred groves. Winter scarcity sharpened tempers and raids were frequent. A single harsh season could turn neighbors into enemies. But these struggles forged the early Russians into something strong, something unbreakable. Their ancestors didn't survive because they were the fiercest warriors, but because they understood how to bend without breaking, how to endure without surrendering. Among these tribes lived a young hunter named Ilarion, born in a small settlement near the edge of the great forests of the north. His story, passed down through generations, stands at the heart of ancient Russian memory. Ilarion was known not for his strength, but for his wisdom. His ability to read the land like a scroll written by the gods. One brutal winter, a storm arose unlike anything the elders had seen. The sky turned black at noon. Winds screamed like mourning spirits. Wolves abandoned the forests and came dangerously close to human settlements. Desperate for food, Ilarion knew his people could not survive another night. Their food reserves had frozen into unbreakable blocks, and the children were already weakening. So he made a decision that seemed impossible. He ventured into the storm alone, seeking the sacred grove of the winter spirits, miles away in a valley, where even wolves feared to tread. For 3 days he wandered through the storm. Snow blinded him. Frost chewed at his fingers. He followed the faint sound of a river he couldn't see, guided by instinct and desperation. Legends say that on the third night, when he was close to collapse, a figure appeared in the storm, a woman of pure white, her hair drifting like snow, her eyes as cold as creation itself. Mo Rana. The winter goddess. She stood before him without speaking. Her presence froze the air. Her gaze was a test, a question without words. Ilarion did not beg. He did not kneel. He simply said, "My people are dying. Give me the strength to save them." Morana touched his forehead with a single finger. The cold should have killed him, but instead it filled him with fire. She spoke at last, her voice like breaking ice. "Strength is not given, it is earned. Return to your people. Show them that winter is a teacher, not an enemy." When Ilarion returned to his settlement, he carried with him an unshakable calm. He led the tribe in digging tunnels beneath the snow, where the earth was warmer. They built underground shelters lined with bark and moss. They carved into frozen rivers to access fish. They set traps in patterns only Ilarion understood. The tribe survived. And from that winter forward, Ilarion was known not as a hunter, but as a leader. His story spread across the region. Other tribes began to follow his methods, forming alliances in the name of survival rather than war. In time, these alliances grew into something larger, a coalition of tribes that historians now believe were the earliest foundations of the Slavic identity, ancient. Russia was not built in a day or even in a century. It grew slowly, like a tree, pushing through frozen soil, each generation adding a new ring of strength. Settlements became villages. Villages became towns. Trade expanded. Stories evolved into shared culture. From this frozen cradle rose the first whispers of a nation, a people shaped by endless winter, hardened by conflict, bound by myth, and driven by the belief that even in the harshest landscape, life could take root and flourish. This is where Russia truly began, not with emperors or armies, but with the ordinary men and women who refused to surrender to the cold. Their legacy is written not on paper, but on the land itself. Their footsteps echo beneath the snow, and their story, born in frost and fire, still shapes the identity of the world's largest nation. And as the frost-born tribes grew into villages and the villages into cities, a new force began to rise quietly at first, like the distant tremble of thunder before a storm. The people who once whispered to forest spirits and carved their hopes into wooden idols now looked toward human leaders, men whose vision stretched wider than the horizons that surrounded them. This transition did not happen in a single moment. It evolved over centuries, shaped by war, hunger, ambition, and the slow realization that survival required more than strength, it required unity. From this need for unity came the idea of the Tsar. The rise of the Tsars did not begin with a crown, but with chaos. Between the 10th and 12th centuries, the lands of Rus were a patchwork of rival princes who fought one another as often as they fought invaders. Each prince ruled a fragment of the land. Kiev, Novgorod, Vladimir, Suzdal, Smolensk, and each believed himself destined to be the greatest. They made alliances through marriages, broke them with betrayals, and spilled blood whenever ambition demanded it. Yet, in the midst of this turmoil, the people desired something more stable than the shifting loyalties of feuding rulers. They wanted a single authority, someone capable of lifting their world out of disorder. Kiev was the first flicker of central power. A city of wooden fortresses, thriving markets, and churches built with Byzantine guidance. But as the Mongol Empire swept across the east, crushing kingdoms like dry leaves beneath boots of iron, but independence was merely the beginning. Even the Third believed that Moscow was destined to become the Third Rome, the spiritual successor to the fallen Byzantines and ancient Romans. He built walls of white stone, towers crowned with shining helmets, and cathedrals that glowed like embers against the northern sky. And with every brick laid, the idea of a powerful, centralized state grew stronger. But even the Third was only the architect. The true birth of Saddam arrived with his grandson Ivan the Fourth, known across the world as Ivan the Terrible. Ivan the Fourth was crowned in 1547 at the age of 16, the first ruler to officially take the title of Tsar, a word derived from Caesar. The ceremony was magnificent. Gold-lined robes draped his shoulders. Priests chanted hymns that echoed through the marble halls. Crowds filled the streets of Moscow as bells rang across the city. To the people, Ivan's coronation felt like the dawn of a new era, a moment when centuries of suffering were finally giving way to unity and strength. Yet beneath the splendor, a darkness already stirred. Ivan's childhood had been a brutal education. Orphaned early, he grew up surrounded by feuding boyars, the powerful noble families who controlled Russia's wealth. As a child, he watched them poison, stab, and strangle rivals. He witnessed betrayal again and again until suspicion became part of his soul. When he finally seized absolute control, Ivan ruled with a mixture of brilliance and terror. He built St. Basil's Cathedral, one of the most breathtaking achievements in Russian architecture, with swirling onion-shaped domes painted in wild colors. It rose above Moscow like a vision from another world. To this day, Americans who visit Russia stand before it in awe, unable to believe such a structure was built in the 16th century. Ivan expanded Russia eastward, defeating the Tatar Khanates and opening vast new territories. Under his rule, Russia began transforming from a kingdom into an empire, but Ivan's brilliance came at a price. His paranoia grew into madness. He created the opulence, a secret police force dressed in black who rode through the streets on dark horses and carried severe dog heads to symbolize their hunt for traitors. They burned towns suspected of disloyalty, executed nobles without trial, and instilled fear so deep that entire families fled into the wilderness, a rebellion in Novgorod exposed the extent of Ivan's brutality. Convinced the city planned to betray him, Ivan ordered a massacre that lasted days. Thousands were drowned in icy rivers, executed in public squares, or tortured in front of their families. When he killed his own son in a fit of rage, the loss plunged him further into despair. Yet even after his death, the throne he created remained unshakable. The age of the Tsars had truly begun, centuries passed, and the Romanov dynasty rose to claim the throne after the chaos of the time of troubles, a period marked by famine, civil war, and foreign invasion. When Michael Romanov was elected Tsar, in 1613 he brought stability to a land scarred by suffering. The Romanovs would rule for more than 300 years, guiding Russia through eras of transformation, glory, and tragedy. Under Tsar Alexei, Russia experienced its first cultural renaissance. Churches bloomed with frescoes and golden icons. Trade expanded. Artisans crafted jewelry and weapons that dazzled foreign visitors. Yet these calm years were merely the quiet before the arrival of one of history's most influential rulers, Peter the Great. Peter the Great was a force of nature, towering, restless, brilliant, and sometimes ruthless. He believed Russia was trapped in the past, chained by tradition and isolation. Determined to modernize his empire, he traveled to Europe disguised as a simple worker, learning shipbuilding, medicine, engineering, and military science. When he returned, he set out to remake Russia by force if necessary. He built a navy from scratch, formed a modern army, reformed government institutions, and demanded that nobles shave their beards and adopt Western clothing. He built St. Petersburg on marshland, a city of stone and water that became Russia's window to the West. The city's architecture stunned European diplomats, and even today American tourists walk along the Neva River mesmerized by its beauty. But Peter's reforms came with a heavy toll. Thousands of laborers died building St. Petersburg in freezing conditions, and those who resisted his changes were punished harshly. After Peter came Catherine the Great, a German-born princess who seized the throne after a coup against her husband. She expanded Russia's borders, reformed education, corresponded with Enlightenment philosophers, and transformed the imperial court into one of the most sophisticated in the world. Her palaces were breathtaking rooms coated in gold, halls filled with mirrors, gardens stretched across miles. To foreign visitors, Imperial Russia under Catherine seemed like a dreamland of wealth and culture. But beneath the glittering surface, millions of serfs lived in conditions that Americans today would compare to slavery. This contrast between luxury and suffering became the defining character of Imperial Russia. Noble families held extravagant balls while peasants struggled to survive brutal winters and crushing taxes. Rebellions erupted, the most famous being Pugachev's rebellion, where a man claiming to be the rightful Tsar rallied thousands of peasants in a desperate attempt to overthrow the system. Catherine crushed the uprising with overwhelming force, but the message was clear. The empire was built on fragile foundations. As the 18th century faded into the 19th, Russia became both a giant and a mystery to the Western world. Its armies defeated Napoleon, its writers stunned the world with literary masterpieces, and its culture blended European elegance with Eastern mystique. Yet its political system remained rigid, controlled by Tsars who ruled with nearly divine authority. America, watching from across the ocean, found Russia both fascinating and alarming, a land capable of immense creativity and immense brutality. Tsar Nicholas I attempted to rule with iron discipline, creating a state built on censorship, surveillance, and military might. His critics disappeared into Siberian labor camps. His supporters basked in the glow of imperial favor. By the time he died, the empire was strong on the outside, but crumbling on the inside. His son, Alexander II, recognized that change was inevitable. In 1861, he issued a historic decree freeing millions of serfs. Many Americans compare this moment to the Emancipation Proclamation, although the consequences in Russia were more complicated. Without land or resources, many former serfs struggled to survive. Still, Alexander II's reforms sparked hope that Russia could evolve peacefully. That hope was shattered when revolutionaries assassinated him with a bomb in the streets of St. Petersburg. His son, Alexander III, responded by reversing many reforms and ruling with authoritarian strength. When he died unexpectedly, his son Nicholas II inherited the throne. Gentle, indecisive, and tragically unprepared, Nicholas II ruled during an age of railroads, telegraphs, factories, and global change. But he governed as though he lived in another century, ignoring the cries of workers, intellectuals, and peasants demanding reform. As the 20th century approached, Russia became a powder keg. Strikes grew, political movements spread, and soldiers returned from the war with Japan in humiliation. The spark came in 1905, when peaceful protesters marched to the Winter Palace seeking aid. Soldiers opened fire, killing hundreds. The event became known as Bloody Sunday and shattered the illusion that the Tsar was a father to his people. Rebellions erupted across the empire. Though Nicholas granted limited reforms, it was too late. Russia was spiraling toward its darkest chapter. By the time World War I erupted, the empire was drowning in poverty, corruption, military failure, and anger. The golden palaces stood like mirages above a land ready to collapse. And collapse it did. In 1917, after centuries of absolute rule, the Romanov dynasty fell. Nicholas II abdicated, ending the age of Tsars forever. The rise of the Tsars is a story of brilliance and brutality, opulence and oppression, triumph and tragedy. It is a story where golden palaces masked the cries of millions, where rulers chased greatness while the empire beneath them fractured. And even today, Americans look at Russia's imperial past with a mixture of awe and disbelief, recognizing it as one of the most dramatic chapters in human history. This was the empire that rose from the frost-born tribes, a world built on contrasts, so extreme that only Russia could contain them. The rise of the Tsars did not begin in polished marble halls or under shimmering chandeliers. It began in a harsh land where winter could break armies and famine could erase entire villages. Yet from that unforgiving soil emerged a dynasty that would carve its name into world history with a mixture of brilliance, cruelty, and unstoppable ambition. When Ivan IV, later known as Ivan the Terrible, placed the crown upon his own head in 1547, Russia was not yet an empire. It was a fragmented state vulnerable to foreign invasion, internal betrayal, and the constant threat of starvation. But Ivan believed Russia could be something greater, something powerful, something eternal. And with that belief came a reign of grand vision and devastating brutality. Ivan's rule was a storm furious, unpredictable, and unforgettable. He built the foundations of a centralized Russian state, expanded the borders into the Volga region, and struck fear into nobles who dared to challenge him. His palace glimmered with gold, yet the dungeons beneath it overflowed with the tortured cries of dissenters. He prayed like a monk, yet punished like a tyrant. He loved poetry and theology, yet unleashed the uprishniki, his black-clad death, riders who turned entire cities into ashes. Russia under Ivan was an empire being born in violent convulsions, a place where faith and fear walked the same corridors. And even as his paranoia consumed him, even as he dealt blow after blow to his own people, even forged a nation too powerful to collapse, when his dynasty fractured, chaos threatened everything he built. The time of troubles dragged the nation to its knees, impostors, coups, famines that forced families to eat bark and frozen grass, invasions from Polish and Swedish armies, and peasants who wandered the forests in desperate search of salvation. It seemed Russia would not survive, until a new dynasty rose from the smoke. The Romanovs were not chosen through divine signs or noble bloodlines alone. They were elected by exhausted nobles and priests who simply prayed for stability. 16-year-old Mikhail Romanov became Tsar not because he was the strongest, but because he was the least threatening. Yet from that timid boy grew a dynasty that would rule for over 3 centuries, transforming Russia from an isolated kingdom into one of the most powerful empires on earth. And at the center of that transformation stood one man whose ambition burned brighter than the northern lights. Peter the Great. Peter was everything his predecessors were not: towering, restless, curious, obsessed with the world beyond Russia's borders. He traveled through Europe in disguise, studying shipbuilding, engineering, anatomy, and military strategy. He drank with dock workers in Amsterdam, dissected corpses in London hospitals, and forced his terrified attendants to shave their beards to match Western fashion. Peter returned to Russia with a vision. He wanted a modern empire, one that would stand shoulder to shoulder with Europe's greatest powers. He built a navy from scratch, reformed the army, introduced new sciences, new schools, new technologies. But progress came with pain. His methods were blunt. His punishments were brutal. When Moscow resisted his changes, he built a new capital on a swamp, St. Petersburg, using the lives of tens of thousands of conscripted laborers who died in the freezing mud to shape his dream. Yet the result was breathtaking. A golden city rising from marshland, a window to Europe glittering with marble, canals, and Italian-inspired palaces. St. Petersburg became the symbol of a new Russia, ambitious, elegant, and ruthlessly engineered. After Peter's death, the empire he built passed through hands both fragile and formidable. Palace coups became common. Ambitious nobles whispered behind velvet curtains. Lovers, generals, and royal guards plotted in the shadows. One Tsar was murdered while bathing, another strangled in his own bedroom, another overthrown by his own wife, who would become one of the most brilliant rulers in European history. Catherine the Great was a woman of contradictions. Born in Prussia, yet more Russian than the Tsars before her. Soft-spoken in public, yet iron-willed in private. An admirer of Enlightenment philosophers who nonetheless relied on an autocratic system to maintain her throne. Under her rule, Russia expanded southward into the Black Sea, crushed rebellions that threatened to tear the empire apart, and absorbed vast territories that would shape the future map of Europe. Her court glittered with French art, Italian opera, and golden halls where chandeliers seemed to float like frozen fireworks. Yet outside her palace walls, millions of serfs lived in poverty so deep that rebellion was always simmering. These contrasts: luxury and suffering, brilliance and violence, innovation and oppression became the heartbeat of Imperial Russia. Rebellion sometimes came quietly, like a whisper in distant fields. Other times it exploded with fury, as in the Pugachev Rebellion, a peasant uprising so massive that Catherine feared the very survival of her empire. But the Tsars always managed to restore control, using armies, alliances, and ruthless discipline. Russia marched steadily forward, expanding across the mountains of the Caucasus, the endless Siberian forests, the valleys of Central Asia, until its empire stretched farther than any nation in history. Yet the very size that made Russia powerful also made it fragile. Each Tsar inherited a realm too vast to understand fully, too diverse to rule easily, too restless to silence forever. While their palaces glowed with gold leaf and Italian marble, entire villages vanished in winter storms. While aristocrats studied French philosophy, soldiers froze on distant frontiers. While royal balls echoed with laughter, revolution whispered in the streets. By the 19th century, the Romanovs stood atop an empire so magnificent it stunned foreign visitors and so explosive it terrified its own rulers. The contrasts grew sharper. Candlelit ballroom floors polished like mirrors while serfs worked under chains. Universities debating progress while censors silenced dissent. Saints and soldiers, poets and prisoners, all living under the shadow of a throne that could grant glory or destruction with a single decree. The rise of the Tsars was not a gentle ascension, but a towering climb over centuries of sacrifice, conquest, genius, and brutality. Their empire soared higher than anyone imagined, yet always trembled beneath its own weight. And even before the storm of revolution came, some sensed that the glitter of Imperial Russia was not eternal. The golden palaces stood bright against the frozen land, but deep inside their walls, cracks had begun to spread. Those cracks did not appear suddenly. They spread slowly, almost invisibly at first, like thin fractures beneath a frozen lake. The Tsars sat upon golden thrones, yet beneath them the empire groaned with tension. The 19th century brought new pressures, ideas of liberty drifting in from Europe, technological revolutions that reshaped cities, and a peasant society still trapped in centuries-old chains. Russia was changing, but its rulers were not ready. To let go of absolute power, Alexander I inherited a nation traumatized by his father's assassination, a trauma that shaped him into a ruler torn between idealism and fear. He spoke often of reform, of easing censorship, of giving the people a voice, but the shadow of his father's murder stayed with him. Every step forward brought a whisper of danger, a reminder that too much change might unleash forces he could not control. When Napoleon's Grand Army invaded in 1812, Alexander's doubts vanished. He found within himself a steel that surprised the world. As Napoleon advanced, burning cities and crushing armies, Alexander refused to surrender. And in the frozen winter, when the French army withered and died along the long Russian roads, the Tsar emerged as Europe's unlikely hero. For the first time, the world looked at Russia not as a distant, exotic land, but as a power capable of shaping continents. Yet victory carried a heavy burden. After the war, while European nations rebuilt with new constitutions and reforms, Russia remained rigid and suffocating under autocratic rule. The young officers who had marched across Europe came home with new ideas burning in their minds, ideas about justice, freedom, and human dignity. When Alexander I died suddenly in 1825, those ideas erupted into the Decembrist uprising. It was small, brief, and tragically disorganized, but it carried a message. The Tsars could not ignore. The empire was too old to remain untouched by modern currents. The uprising was crushed with deadly efficiency, and its leaders were executed or exiled to Siberia. But the seeds of rebellion had been planted. Nicholas I, who took the throne after the failed revolt, believed in one principle above all others: absolute order. He saw himself as the empire's iron spine, the defender of tradition against the chaos of Western ideas. Under his rule, censorship tightened like a noose. Secret police infiltrated every corner of society, and loyalty to the throne became a matter of survival. His world was one of polished military parades, strict discipline, and a cold, measured determination to keep Russia still while the world outside raced forward. Yet the empire he ruled was too large, too diverse, too restless to be held in place. Serfs worked land they did not own. bound to masters who often treated them as property rather than human beings. In the cities, new industries created new hardships. Intellectuals whispered about reform while peasants endured famines and crushing. Taxes. When the Crimean War broke out, Russia discovered the price of resisting modernization. Its armies were brave, its people loyal, but its infrastructure was decades behind Europe's. Railways were scarce, weapons outdated, and communication painfully slow. The war exposed the empire's weaknesses with brutal clarity, and when I died during the conflict. Some said it was not illness that killed him, but the shock of his nation's failures. His son, Alexander II, understood what had to be done. He embraced reform not as a moral duty, but as a desperate necessity. In 1861, he issued the Emancipation Manifesto, freeing more than 20 million serfs in the largest social reform in European history. The empire shook with hope. For the first time, millions of people tasted the possibility of controlling their own destiny. But emancipation came with complications. Land was expensive, freedom was limited, and many peasants found themselves drowning in debt. Still, Alexander II pushed forward, modernizing the courts, expanding railways, opening universities. His reforms breathed life into a suffocating system, but with progress came backlash. Radicals wanted more freedom, more rights, more systemic change. Conservatives wanted none at all. Terrorist groups formed in the shadows, believing violence was the only way to break the autocracy. Alexander II, the Tsar who freed the serfs, became the Tsar hunted by revolutionaries. In 1881, as his carriage passed along a snowy canal in St. Petersburg, a bomb exploded beneath him. He died only moments after signing a plan for further reforms. His death sent shockwaves through the empire. His son, Alexander III, responded by reversing many reforms and tightening the grip of authority. He was a giant of a man, towering and broad-shouldered, with a worldview built on suspicion and control. Under his rule, Russia became a fortress of reaction. But he also brought stability, no palace coups, no major wars, no uprisings on a massive scale. It was a calm before an unimaginable storm. When Alexander III died prematurely, the throne passed to his son, Nicholas II, a gentle, soft-spoken man who loved his family deeply but was utterly unprepared for the weight of empire. He believed autocracy was sacred, a divine responsibility passed down from his ancestors. But the Russia he inherited was no longer the Russia of Peter the Great or Catherine the Great. It was a nation aching for change, industrial workers demanding rights, peasants starving under outdated systems, intellectuals debating revolution, and radical groups planning violence in the shadows. Nicholas II faced more pressure than any Tsar before him. The Russo-Japanese War exposed Russia's military weaknesses. Bloody protests erupted in the streets, culminating in the tragedy of Bloody Sunday, where peaceful demonstrators were shot by imperial guards. Faith in the Tsar began to fracture. For the first time in centuries, the people no longer believed their ruler cared for them. Even the golden palaces, with their endless halls, crystal chandeliers, and Italian frescoes, could not hide the truth. The empire was reaching a breaking point. Still, Nicholas resisted reform. His advisors urged him to modernize politically. His generals warned him about rising unrest. But Nicholas's belief in autocracy remained unshaken, even as the world around him changed at dizzying speed. The empire felt like a magnificent ship sailing into a storm, glorious, towering, beautifully constructed, but dangerously slow to turn. By the early 20th century, Russia was a land of extraordinary contrasts. St. Petersburg and Moscow glowed with electric lights, opera houses, universities, and factories. But just beyond these cities lay villages frozen in time, where peasants lived as their ancestors had centuries before. The elite dined in gilded halls while entire provinces faced famine. Imperial guards polished their uniforms while revolutionaries prepared bombs in secret basements. The Tsars had built a world of breathtaking beauty and unimaginable suffering. A world where loyalty and hatred lived side by side. Nicholas II loved his family deeply, perhaps more than he loved the empire he ruled. His devotion to his wife, Alexandra, and their children was profound, but it blinded him to the political chaos gathering around him. When World War I erupted, a conflict he entered with patriotic optimism, the Russian Empire was pushed past its limits. Millions of soldiers died on the front lines. Food shortages grew unbearable. Transportation collapsed. Entire cities trembled with rage and desperation. Nicholas clung to hope, to tradition, to faith. But the empire he loved was slipping through his fingers. By 1917, the storm that had been building for centuries finally broke. The winter of 1917 did not feel like an ordinary winter. It felt heavier, darker, as if the very air carried the weight of an empire on the verge of collapse. In the streets of Petrograd, factory workers marched with empty stomachs. Soldiers returning from the front no longer saluted their officers. Bread lines grew longer, tempers shorter, and whispers of revolution drifted through taverns, barracks, and marketplaces like sparks looking for dry tinder. The empire that had once stretched across continents had come to a moment where even its vastness could not protect it from the pressure building inside. Nicholas II, far from the capital, was traveling with his military staff near the front lines. He believed that if he remained close to his soldiers, he could inspire them, steady them, and hold the war effort together. But loyalty was slipping faster than anyone could control. Reports reached him of riots in Petrograd, of railways shutting down, of government ministers begging him to return. Yet each time he hesitated. He trusted tradition, he trusted loyalty, he trusted the belief that the people, despite their suffering, would rally around their Tsar just as they had in times past. But this time, history was not repeating itself. This time, something fundamental had changed. Back in the capital, Alexandra struggled to hold the court together. But her isolation, her reliance on a mystic healer named Rasputin, and her mistrust of the political elite made her deeply unpopular. Many believed she was more loyal to Rasputin than to the needs of the people. Even before the war, rumors had spread about the monk's influence over the royal family, and after his assassination, in 1916, those rumors only grew darker and more exaggerated. The American audience would recognize this moment as the classic unraveling of power the kind seen when a leader's circle narrows. When trust decays and when fear replaces judgment. As strikes consumed Petrograd and soldiers refused orders to fire on the crowds, the government's control disintegrated. When Nicholas finally attempted to return to the capital, his train was stopped by mutinous troops. The empire that once bowed at the Tsar's command now barred his path. Advisors, generals, and even family members began to urge him toward an unthinkable choice: abdication. Nicholas resisted at first. The idea of giving up a throne held by his family for over 3 centuries felt like a betrayal of everything he believed in. But the truth was undeniable. He was no longer ruling an empire. He was a man surrounded by collapsing pillars, with no path left except surrender. On March 15, 1917, Nicholas II signed the document that ended the Romanov dynasty. There was no ceremony, no dramatic speech, no royal announcement. It was a quiet moment inside a railway carriage, witnessed by only a handful of men. With his signature, the empire of the Tsars, the empire of golden palaces, iron-fisted rulers, breathtaking beauty, and unbearable suffering vanished into history. The world had shifted. The age of autocracy was over, but the story did not end with Nicholas's abdication. The provisional government that replaced him struggled to hold the fractured nation together. They promised democracy, promised freedom, promised a new beginning, but their timing could not have been worse. Russia was bleeding from the world war, starving from crop failures, and exhausted from decades of broken promises. Even hope, once so strong, began to falter. Meanwhile, in the shadows, a different force was gathering strength. Vladimir Lenin, sharpened by years of exile, returned to Russia with a single aim: to build a revolution that would not stop halfway like the one in February. He saw the provisional government as weak, temporary, and destined to fail. With fiery speeches, he rallied workers, soldiers, and peasants around a vision more radical than anything Russia had ever witnessed. His message was frighteningly simple: peace, land, and bread. In a starving, desperate nation, these words were more powerful than any throne or palace. The months that followed were steeped in chaos. Streets filled with protests, arguments split political parties. Soldiers deserted in record numbers, and famine loomed over entire regions. By October, the final thread holding the old Russia together snapped. Lenin's Bolsheviks seized key buildings in Petrograd, stormed the Winter Palace, and arrested members of the provisional government. No grand battle erupted, no armies clashed. Instead, the centuries-old world of Tsars fell quietly, almost eerily, under the weight of its own contradictions. Yet even in revolution, the Romanov family remained a loose end the new regime could not ignore. Nicholas, Alexandra, and their children were moved from palace to palace, treated not as royalty but as political prisoners. They lived in small rooms, ate simple meals, and watched their world shrink day by day. Still, Nicholas kept his dignity. Alexandra clung to her faith. The children found moments of normal childhood between locked doors and guarded corridors. To many Americans, the image of the Romanovs in captivity feels like the tragic final act in a great historical drama, an iconic fall from unimaginable splendor to quiet confinement. But as the Civil War erupted between the Red Army and the anti-Bolshevik forces, holding the Romanovs became dangerous. They were symbols that could inspire enemies, unify armies, or restore the monarchy. As the front lines shifted closer to the town of Ekaterinburg, where the family was held, the Bolsheviks made a decision meant to erase the possibility of restoration forever. On a July night in 1989, the Romanovs were awakened and told they were being moved for their safety. Instead, they were led into a basement room. What followed was brutal, clumsy, and horrifying. The execution marked the true final end of Imperial Russia. No Tsar would ever rule again. No palace would ever carry that same weight. The empire built over centuries dissolved into revolution, civil war, and a new ideology that promised equality but delivered decades of struggle. Yet even as the dynasty died, the legacy of the Tsars continued to haunt the nation they once ruled. Their palaces still stood symbols of ambition and excess. Their policies, their choices, their triumphs, and their failures shaped the psychology of the Russian people. The contradictions that had defined Imperial Russia did not disappear with the gunfire in that basement. They lingered, echoing across generations, influencing the Soviet era and shaping the identity of Russia. Even today, the rise of the Tsars had been a story of dreams, carved in gold and shadows cast in blood. Their empire had been magnificent and brutal, visionary and flawed. And though the throne fell, though the dynasty ended, their imprint on history remains as powerful as the icy winds that once shaped the land itself. With the Romanovs gone and the throne empty, Russia entered a period of chaos unlike anything the world had seen before. The fall of centuries-old autocracy created a vacuum so vast that it seemed impossible to fill. Across the sprawling empire, from the frozen tundras of Siberia to the rolling hills of Ukraine, people struggled to grasp what had just happened. Soldiers who had once fought for the Tsar now wandered aimlessly, questioning loyalties. Peasants who had long suffered under feudal oppression now tasted freedom, but freedom without structure brought its own anxieties. Entire communities faced famine, disease, and uncertainty as the old systems dissolved faster than the snow melting under spring sun. Amid this turmoil, the Bolsheviks moved with precision and ruthlessness. Lenin, the revolutionary strategist, understood that ideology alone would not win the new Russia. Power had to be seized and maintained with absolute force. By late 1917, the Red Army was organizing, spreading into key cities and ensuring that counter-revolutionaries had no chance to consolidate. Meanwhile, the former aristocrats, officers loyal to the Tsar, and various regional governors coalesced into the White Army. What followed was a civil war so brutal and fragmented that entire regions became battlegrounds for survival rather than strategy. The violence was unprecedented. In cities, propaganda painted enemies in stark black and white terms, while entire towns were conscripted, plundered, or burned depending on who controlled the railroads. Peasants sometimes switched sides more than once, trying desperately to survive rather than fight for ideology. The American imagination can scarcely grasp the scale. Millions of Russians were killed in combat, starved by sieges, or executed in purges. Families were split, villages destroyed, and the social fabric that had bound communities for centuries was ripped apart. The Bolsheviks' victory was not just military but psychological. They centralized power, outlawed opposition, and used fear as a tool to maintain control. Lenin, who had survived years of exile and plotted revolution with unrelenting patience, became the figurehead of a new Russia that rejected monarchs, palaces, and aristocratic privilege. Cities that had once celebrated imperial pageantry now witnessed parades of workers and soldiers, banners proclaiming equality, and rallies demanding loyalty to the party rather than to a throne. Yet the human cost was staggering. Former nobles, priests, and anyone associated with the Tsarist regime were executed, exiled, or imprisoned. The Red Terror, as it became known, swept across the land with an almost mechanical efficiency. Entire families vanished overnight. Wealth and property were seized. Orthodox churches, once centers of spiritual and cultural life, were closed, repurposed, or destroyed. The very symbols of the old Russia, the gilded domes, the palace halls, the artifacts of centuries were threatened with erasure. But out of this chaos, a new identity began to emerge. Lenin's vision, though harsh, created the framework for centralized governance, industrialization, and social reform. Education and literacy campaigns were launched. Railroads, factories, and communications networks were expanded. The empire of ice and gold had collapsed, but a new kind of Russia, modern, ideologically driven Russia, was rising from the ashes. Even as Lenin ruled, the American observer could see the familiar human drama: ambition, fear, sacrifice, and ingenuity playing out on a massive scale. Russia had always been a land of extremes, and the revolution amplified them. The Tsar's legacy, the brilliance of the palaces, the cruelty of the rulers, the stark contrast between opulence and poverty had left a psychological mark that even the Bolsheviks could not erase. Russians remembered both the beauty and the terror of their past, and these memories shaped the ideology and actions of the new state. When Lenin died in 1924, the battle for succession began, ushering in Joseph Stalin. The stage was set for a Russia even more unrecognizable from the imperial past, yet in some ways shaped by it. Stalin's rule would take the centralized authority that Tsars had wielded. the absolute power they exercised and amplify it through industrialization, collectivization, and terror. The lessons of history, the fear of rebellion, the importance of control, the power of ideology were in full effect. As the 20th century unfolded, Imperial Russia's ghosts lingered in every policy, every decision, every city rebuilt from rubble. The memory of golden palaces, of brutal politics, and of centuries-long hierarchies shaped how the Soviet state approached authority, loyalty, and survival. The rise of the Tsars, with all its contradictions and extremes, had created a culture of centralized power, obedience, and awe for those in control. In many ways, the revolution did not erase history, it transformed it, folding it into a new narrative of power, struggle, and vision. For an American audience, it is impossible not to marvel at the sheer scale of transformation. In a single human lifetime, Russia went from the frostborn empires of the Tsars, through a revolution that seemed impossible, and into the Soviet era, where ideology replaced monarchy and survival demanded obedience to a party rather than to a person. The landscape, both physical and psychological, was forever altered. And yet the echoes of those golden palaces, those dramatic contrasts, and the personalities of the Tsars remained, haunting the collective memory and continuing to influence Russia's place in the world. Even today, when one walks through St. Petersburg or Moscow, the juxtaposition is palpable. Marble halls and gilded ceilings stand beside monuments to revolution. Churches rebuilt alongside Soviet statues testify to resilience, adaptation, and memory. The dramatic contrast that defined Imperial Russia opulence and cruelty, ambition and fear, power and rebellion remain etched in the streets, the architecture and the psyche of a nation that has survived centuries of extremes. As the Bolsheviks consolidated power, the vast and fractured empire began a dramatic transformation. Cities were rebuilt, factories rose from the ruins, and railways expanded to connect the farthest reaches of the continent. Lenin's vision, while revolutionary, was only the first step in a journey that would redefine Russia. The Tsars' golden palaces and imperial courts had been swept away, but the echoes of centralized power and dramatic contrasts remained embedded in the Russian psyche. Every decree, every reform, and every state-controlled factory carried with it the lessons of centuries: ambition and authority, fear and loyalty, brilliance and brutality. Joseph Stalin emerged as the central figure to carry this vision forward. Like the Tsars before him, Stalin understood the importance of absolute control, but he applied it on a scale previously unimaginable. He industrialized the nation with ruthless efficiency, forced collectivization upon millions, and reshaped the countryside into a state of obedience and productivity. Cities gleamed with factories, schools multiplied, and literacy campaigns reached millions. Yet the human cost was staggering. Famine, purges, and mass executions created a climate of terror, reminiscent of the Oprychnina of Ivan the Terrible or the secret police of Nicholas I. The parallels between Tsarist absolutism and Soviet centralization were undeniable, even as ideology replaced monarchy. Meanwhile, Russia's cultural landscape was reborn. Art, literature, and music reflected both triumph and tragedy. Ballet companies toured across Europe, painters challenged old conventions, and writers documented the staggering changes with a mix of awe and horror. The Soviet state, much like the Tsars' court centuries before, cultivated a carefully curated image of power and prestige. Yet behind the public face, the suffering, rebellion, and fear that had always defined Russian life simmered just beneath the surface. World events continued to shape the nation. The Second World War tested Soviet Russia's endurance like no other period in its history. Cities were bombed, millions died, And yet, through unimaginable hardship, the nation endured and ultimately emerged as a global superpower. In every sense, the Russian state had evolved, but the dramatic contrasts of wealth and suffering, ambition and obedience, beauty and brutality persisted. These contrasts, born in the age of the Tsars, had become intrinsic to Russia's identity, influencing politics, culture, and society for generations. For Americans observing from across the Atlantic, this journey is both fascinating and cautionary. Russia's history demonstrates how a nation can be shaped by extremes, by visionary leaders and ruthless rulers, by creative brilliance and devastating oppression, by frozen landscapes and golden palaces. It reminds us that the legacies of leadership, power, and rebellion echo across centuries, influencing societies long after the original rulers have vanished. And so, from the frost-born beginnings of ancient tribes to the magnificent, violent reigns of the Tsars, through revolution, war, and rebirth, Russia's story is one of survival, ambition, and transformation. The frozen forests and golden domes, the brutal politics and the soaring art, the rebellions and the empires, they are all threads in a tapestry that continues to shape the world's largest nation. The echoes of the Tsars are still felt in every corner of Russia, in every monument, in every policy, and in the collective memory of its people. History, in this sense, is never truly past. It is alive, flowing through the streets of Moscow and St. Petersburg, whispering from the pages of old chronicles and resonating in the minds of those who seek to understand how an empire rises, falls, and rises again in a new form. The story of Russia, its extremes, its drama, its beauty, and its brutality is a story that captivates, teaches, and reminds us that the past shapes the present in ways both visible and unseen. So the story of the Tsars is more than a tale of power and palace intrigue. It is a testament to human ambition, resilience, and the enduring impact of history itself. Like the frozen rivers that once shaped the empire's borders, or the golden domes that reached toward the heavens, the legacy of Russia's past continues to flow through the world, waiting for those who dare to witness it, understand it, and learn from it. And if you enjoyed this journey through centuries of Russian history, don't forget to share, and subscribe to the channel. I eagerly await your thoughts in the comments, because your curiosity and questions keep these stories alive. And together we continue exploring the past to understand our world today.